I remember the exact moment I realized my own brother had planned to throw me out of the only home our family had left, and strangely enough, it started with a perfectly folded napkin beside my plate on Thanksgiving morning. The house smelled exactly the way it always had on this holiday, warm and comforting, like cinnamon drifting through the hallway vents and roasted turkey slowly turning golden inside the oven. I had arrived just after 8 that morning, carrying a pumpkin pie I'd baked the night before in my small apartment across town. The sky over Maplewood Drive was pale gray, the kind of late November morning when the air feels sharp against your cheeks, maybe 40 degrees at most, and the maple trees in the yard were already bare. This house had been standing here since 1968, long before the neighborhood filled with SUVs and new mailboxes, back when my parents bought it for $43,000 and believed they'd live here forever. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life this house had been the center of every Thanksgiving we ever celebrated. My mother used to wake up before sunrise to start the turkey, humming quietly in the kitchen while the Macy's parade played on the television in the living room. Even after she passed 2 years ago, I tried to keep the tradition alive. I still remembered her voice the last time we spoke about the house. She had been sitting at the small oak table near the window, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, telling me softly that some homes carry memories the way old photo albums do. That morning, when I walked through the front door, I felt those memories everywhere. The hardwood floor creaked the same way it always had beneath my shoes. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked slowly, steady, and familiar. My brother Daniel was already there, standing near the kitchen island with a mug of coffee in his hand. He greeted me with a wide smile that felt slightly too cheerful for 8 in the morning. Daniel was 64, 3 years older than me, and he had always been the practical one in the family, the kind of man who talked about property taxes and interest rates even during holiday dinners. His wife Rachel stood beside him slicing celery, her movements neat and careful, as if she were arranging something more important than vegetables. She gave me a quick hug that felt polite but distant, the kind of hug you give a coworker instead of family. For a while everything looked normal. The turkey rested on the counter waiting to go into the oven. The television played a morning news segment about travel delays across the Midwest. Rachel set out plates while Daniel poured apple cider into glasses. But when I walked toward the dining table, something small caught my attention. Right there beside the plate where I always sat, the one facing the living room window, was a long manila envelope. It was placed carefully on top of a folded napkin, as if it belonged there as much as the silverware. At first I thought it might be a Thanksgiving card, maybe something sentimental Rachel had prepared. But the envelope looked heavier than a greeting card, the thick kind used for legal documents. I remember touching the edge of it with my fingertips and feeling a strange chill run through me. The same quiet instinct that tells you when something isn't quite right even if you can't explain why. Across the table Daniel watched me for a moment, still smiling in that same calm way, and then he said in a voice that sounded almost casual, "Don't open it yet, Margaret. Let's wait until everyone's sitting down." I nodded slowly, though I couldn't understand why a simple envelope needed an audience. The smell of the turkey filled the kitchen as Rachel finally slid the pan into the oven. The clock ticked on the wall. Outside, a cold wind rustled the empty branches in the front yard. And as I sat down in my usual chair staring at that sealed envelope, I had the uneasy feeling that this Thanksgiving morning was about to become something our family would never forget. For a few minutes no one said anything about the envelope. Daniel went back to the kitchen island and poured himself another cup of coffee, while Rachel adjusted the oven temperature and checked the turkey, as if the morning were unfolding exactly the way she expected. I stayed seated at the dining table, my hands resting on the polished oak surface that had been part of our family dinners for more than 40 years. The envelope remained beside my plate, perfectly, aligned with the fork and knife, like it was part of the place setting. I could hear the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of a marching band drifting from the television in the living room where the Thanksgiving parade had just begun. When we were children, Daniel and I used to sit on the carpet in front of that same television every Thanksgiving morning waiting for the parade floats to appear. Our mother would bring us hot chocolate in large ceramic mugs, while our father carved the turkey hours later in the afternoon. Back then this house felt enormous, filled with cousins, laughter, and the sound of chairs sliding across the floor as everyone tried to squeeze around the table. I looked around the room now and realized how quiet it felt compared to those years. The walls still held the same framed photographs of family gatherings, graduations, and birthdays. One picture near the hallway showed Daniel and me standing in the front yard sometime in the early 1970s, both of us wearing thick winter coats and holding small paper turkeys we made in elementary school. It was strange how memories could stay perfectly clear even after decades passed. Rachel eventually walked over carrying a stack of white plates and began setting them on the table one by one. Her movements were careful and deliberate, almost rehearsed. She did not mention the envelope either. Instead, she asked me politely if I had any trouble finding parking on the street that morning. I told her it had been easy because most of the neighbors had already left to visit relatives in other towns. Daniel returned from the kitchen holding a bowl of cranberry sauce and placed it near the center of the table. He looked relaxed, almost satisfied, as if he had already finished something important before the day had even begun. I tried to ignore the growing curiosity inside my chest, but my eyes kept drifting back to the envelope. The paper was thick and slightly textured, the kind usually used by law offices or government buildings. There was no handwriting on the outside, only a small printed label in the corner that I could not read clearly from where I sat. I wondered why Daniel had asked me to wait before opening it. Thanksgiving in our family had never involved surprises like that. Usually, the most exciting moment was when someone revealed a new dessert recipe or brought an extra pie. After a few minutes, Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 9:30 in the morning. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together as if he were preparing to start a meeting rather than a holiday meal. Rachel sat down across from me and smoothed the tablecloth with both hands. Her eyes briefly met mine and then moved to the envelope beside my plate. That was the moment I realized the envelope had not been placed there by accident. It had been set there intentionally, waiting for the exact moment Daniel had in mind. Outside the window, a cold gust of wind rattled the bare branches of the maple tree in the front yard. Inside the house, the smell of roasting turkey slowly filled the air, warm and familiar, the same smell that had always meant comfort and family to me. Yet as the seconds passed and Daniel continued watching the clock, that familiar comfort began to feel like something else entirely, like the quiet stillness before a conversation that could change everything. Daniel finally cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table the same way our father used to do when he was about to say grace before Thanksgiving dinner. The clock on the wall showed 9:35 in the morning, and the parade music from the living room drifted softly through the hallway. For a brief moment, I wondered if Daniel was simply waiting for the turkey to cook longer or for another relative to arrive. But then I remembered that this year there were no cousins coming, no neighbors dropping by, no extra chairs pulled from the garage. It was only the three of us in the house that morning, sitting around a table that once held more than a dozen people. Daniel looked at Rachel and gave a small nod, as if confirming that the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Rachel folded her hands in front of her and gave him the same careful smile she had been wearing since I walked through the door. Then Daniel turned his attention back to me and glanced briefly at the envelope beside my plate. I felt the weight of his gaze even before he spoke. The room seemed quieter than before, almost too quiet for a holiday morning. Even the refrigerator stopped humming for a few seconds, as if the house itself were listening. Daniel said my name slowly, Margaret, the way someone does when they want to make sure every word that follows will be remembered. He told me there was something important we needed to discuss before the meal began. His tone sounded calm and almost professional, the way a banker might explain a loan agreement or a realtor might describe closing papers at the end of a long meeting. I tried to keep my expression neutral, even though a strange uneasiness had begun to settle in my chest. I had known my brother for 67 years, long enough to recognize when he had already made up his mind about something. When Daniel decided to do something, he rarely changed course. I slowly slid the envelope a few inches closer to me across the table. The paper made a soft sound against the wood surface. Up close, I could see that the label printed in the corner contained the name of a law office located downtown about 5 miles from this house. That detail alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. We had never needed lawyers for anything related to Thanksgiving. I looked at Daniel and asked quietly why a law office would be sending me an envelope on a holiday morning. For a moment, he did not answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and took a sip of coffee, giving himself a few extra seconds before speaking again. Rachel watched both of us carefully, her eyes moving from Daniel to me and back again. Finally, Daniel placed the mug down on the table and spoke in a voice that sounded steady and almost rehearsed. He told me the envelope contained documents that had been prepared earlier that week, and that it would be better for everyone if I read them now while we were all together. I noticed he chose his words carefully, as if he had practiced the sentence more than once before saying it aloud. The smell of the turkey continued drifting through the kitchen as the oven timer ticked quietly in the background. I rested my fingers on the edge of the envelope and felt how thick the stack of papers inside seemed to be. Outside the window, a car drove slowly down Maplewood Drive and then disappeared around the corner. Inside the dining room, Daniel watched me with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. Rachel remained perfectly still across the table, her hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. I realized then that whatever was inside that envelope had been planned long before I arrived with my pumpkin pie that morning. Daniel gave a small gesture toward the envelope and said gently that it was time for me to open it. I took a slow breath, slid one finger under the paper flap, and began to pull it open while both of them watched in complete silence. I slowly pulled the stack of papers from the envelope and placed them on the table in front of me, feeling the weight of Daniel's eyes and Rachel's quiet attention as if both of them had been waiting for this exact moment all morning. The top page was printed on thick white paper with a formal letterhead from the same law office whose name I had noticed on the corner of the envelope earlier. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the words without fully understanding what I was seeing. The title across the top of the document was written in large bold letters that immediately made my heart tighten. It said notice to vacate property. I blinked once and then read the first line again slowly, making sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. The document stated that I was being formally notified that my presence in the house at 214 Maplewood Drive was no longer authorized, and that I would be required to leave the property within 30 days. The language sounded cold and distant, the kind of legal phrasing that felt completely out of place in the dining room where my family had shared Thanksgiving dinners for decades. I lowered the paper slightly and looked across the table at Daniel. He was watching me calmly, his hands folded together as if we were discussing something ordinary like home repairs or utility bills. Rachel remained silent beside him, but there was a faint expression of expectation in her eyes, as if she had been rehearsing this moment in her mind long before today. I turned my attention back to the paper and continued reading. The document explained that ownership of the house had been legally transferred earlier that year and that the current property holder had authorized the eviction notice through their legal representative. I felt a slow wave of disbelief spread through me. This house had belonged to our parents for more than 50 years, and after our mother passed away, I had believed that Daniel and I would simply continue sharing responsibility for it the way families usually did with homes full of memories. I carefully placed the first page on the table and looked at the next sheet beneath it. There were several more documents clipped together, each one repeating the same message in slightly different legal language. According to these papers, I was no longer considered a resident of the property. I was now classified as someone occupying the house without permission. The words felt strange even in my thoughts because only a few hours earlier I had walked through the front door with a pumpkin pie and greeted my brother in the same hallway where we had celebrated countless holidays together. I lifted my eyes from the documents and asked Daniel quietly if he was serious. My voice sounded steadier than I expected, although inside I could feel my heart beating faster. Daniel nodded once and leaned forward slightly. He told me that everything written in the documents was correct and that the transfer of ownership had already been finalized several months ago. According to him, the law office had simply needed the right moment to deliver the notice officially. Rachel spoke for the first time since I opened the envelope. She said in a calm voice that it was better to handle these matters clearly rather than let misunderstandings continue. The smell of the turkey drifted from the oven again, warm and familiar, but now the comforting scent only made the silence around the table feel heavier. I looked down at the stack of papers once more and slowly placed them back into the envelope. The legal language might have sounded final, but something about the situation still did not feel complete to me. After 67 years of knowing my brother, I had learned that important decisions rarely appeared without a long story behind them. And as Daniel sat across from me waiting for my reaction, I realized that whatever explanation he planned to give next would likely change the meaning of this Thanksgiving morning forever. I rested my hand on the envelope for a moment before sliding it slightly away from my plate, as if creating a little distance between myself and the words that had just changed the tone of the entire morning. Daniel continued watching me with that same patient expression, the one he used whenever he believed he had already explained everything that needed to be said. Rachel leaned back in her chair and folded her hands neatly in her lap, as though the most difficult part of the conversation had already passed. The oven hummed softly behind them, and somewhere in the living room the parade announcer's cheerful voice described a giant balloon floating above Manhattan. The contrast felt almost surreal. I looked at Daniel and asked him a simple question. When did this happen? My voice sounded calm, but inside I felt a quiet confusion growing, the kind that comes when familiar pieces of your life suddenly stop fitting together. Daniel sighed lightly and reached for his coffee mug again. He told me the transfer of ownership had been completed during the summer, sometime in July, after several discussions with the law office downtown. According to him, the process had taken weeks to finalize, including paperwork filed with the county clerk and a property reassessment that updated the home value to nearly $380,000. He spoke about these details the same way someone might explain a business decision, carefully and without emotion. I listened without interrupting, trying to understand how something so significant could have happened without my knowledge. This house had been the center of our family for more than half a century. After our mother passed away 2 years earlier, I had spent nearly every weekend here, cleaning the kitchen cabinets, sorting through old photographs, and keeping the garden alive in the backyard the way she used to do. Daniel had visited occasionally, but I was the one who made sure the property taxes were paid on time and that the heating system was serviced before every winter. I reminded him of that quietly, not with anger but with genuine confusion. Daniel nodded as if he expected the question. He explained that the legal change had been based on documents our mother signed before she passed away. According to him, she had decided the house should remain under a single owner in order to avoid disagreements in the future. Rachel added that the lawyer had recommended this arrangement because shared ownership sometimes led to complicated disputes later on. Their explanations sounded organized and rehearsed, almost as if they had anticipated every question I might ask. I glanced again at the envelope and the stack of documents inside it. The legal language had been very clear about one thing. Someone now held full authority over this property, and according to Daniel, that person was him. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the dining room again. The same oak table stood in the center of the room, polished by decades of holiday meals. The framed photographs still hung on the walls, including the picture of my parents taken on their 40th anniversary, standing right outside the front door. Every corner of this house held a memory that belonged to our family. It was difficult to imagine that a few signatures on legal forms could suddenly redefine my place here. Rachel glanced toward the kitchen and mentioned that the turkey would be ready in about 2 hours. Her voice carried a strange normality, as if this were simply another family conversation happening before lunch. Daniel then leaned forward slightly and placed both hands on the table again. He told me that he understood the situation might feel surprising, but he believed it was the most practical arrangement for the future. The law office had already filed everything properly, and the documents in front of me were simply the official notice required by state regulations. I studied his face for a moment, searching for any sign that he might still see this house the same way I did, as a place filled with history rather than a piece of property. Instead, his expression remained calm and firm. That was when I began to realize that Daniel had not chosen Thanksgiving morning by accident. He had chosen it because he believed the holiday atmosphere would make the conversation easier to accept. The smell of the turkey continued filling the house, warm and familiar, but the meaning of this Thanksgiving had already begun to change in ways I had never imagined. For several seconds I said nothing. I simply sat there at the same dining table where my family had shared Thanksgiving meals for more than 40 years, looking at my brother, as if I were seeing a slightly different version of him for the first time. Daniel had always been practical, but this was something else entirely. This was a decision planned quietly, carefully, and long before this morning. I folded my hands on the table and asked him one more question. Why did you wait until today to tell me? Daniel looked down at the tablecloth for a moment before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had already considered that question many times before. He explained that the lawyer advised delivering the notice in person so there would be no confusion about the legal process. According to him, Thanksgiving seemed like a moment when we would all already be together in the house. Rachel nodded slightly when he said this, confirming that the timing had been discussed. I listened quietly, noticing how carefully they both spoke, choosing each word with the same caution someone might use during a formal meeting. Outside the dining room window, the pale morning light had grown brighter, and a few dry leaves moved slowly across the yard as the wind picked up again. The house itself felt strangely still. I realized then that Daniel truly believed this conversation was simply a practical step, something necessary to move forward with his plans for the property. I asked him what those plans were. Daniel did not hesitate. He said the house was larger than he and Rachel really needed, and maintaining it alone would be expensive over time. The property taxes had increased every year, and the roof would eventually need repairs. He explained that a real estate agent had already visited the house earlier in the fall and estimated its current market value at nearly $400,000 because Maplewood Drive had become one of the more desirable streets in the area. Rachel added that several younger families had already moved into nearby homes during the past 2 years, which meant the neighborhood would likely continue increasing in value. Their words painted a clear picture. Daniel was not just claiming ownership of the house. He was preparing to sell it. I looked around the room again as I listened. The same photographs still hung on the walls. The same oak cabinet still held our mother's china plates that only came out during holidays. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway continued its slow ticking rhythm, counting seconds the same way it had since our parents bought it decades ago. I asked Daniel if he truly believed selling the house was what our mother would have wanted. For the first time that morning, he hesitated slightly before answering. He said our mother had always been practical about money, and that she would probably understand the decision if she saw how valuable the property had become. Rachel gently reminded him that the real estate market had been very active that year, and that buyers often made offers within days of a listing. As they spoke, I realized something important. Daniel and Rachel had already imagined the future of this house without me in it. They had discussed the sale price, the paperwork, even the possibility of new owners walking through the front door. To them, the memories inside these walls were simply part of the past, while the value of the property represented an opportunity. I rested my hand again on the envelope containing the eviction notice and felt the edge of the paper beneath my fingertips. Daniel watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction, perhaps expecting anger or disbelief. Instead, I remained quiet for a moment longer, thinking about everything he had just explained. Then I lifted my eyes and asked him one final question in a calm voice. Did the lawyer also tell you to read every document carefully before making a decision about this house? Daniel frowned slightly, as if he did not understand the reason for the question. Rachel also looked confused for a brief moment. But I already knew something they did not. And for the first time since I opened that envelope, I felt completely certain that this Thanksgiving morning was far from over. I noticed the small crease that appeared between Daniel's eyebrows after I asked that question, the kind of expression people make when they realize a conversation is no longer following the path they expected. For a moment, neither he nor Rachel spoke. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway filled the space between us, while the smell of roasting turkey continued drifting through the kitchen. I kept my voice calm because there was no reason to raise it. After 67 years of life, I had learned that the quietest moments often carried the most meaning. Daniel finally asked what I meant by that question. I looked down at the envelope again, then back at him. I told him that legal documents can sometimes be complicated, especially when they involve property that has belonged to a family for more than half a century. Daniel nodded slowly as if agreeing with that statement, though he still looked slightly puzzled. Rachel leaned forward a little, resting her arms on the table. I could tell they both believed the situation was already settled. In their minds, the paperwork had been completed months ago. The lawyer had prepared the eviction notice, and today was simply the moment when I would be informed about it. But there was one small detail they had overlooked. I remembered the afternoon 2 years earlier when our mother asked me to sit beside her in the living room only a few weeks before she passed away. The late autumn sunlight had been coming through the same window that now looked out onto the quiet front yard. She had handed me a folder containing several documents and asked me to read them carefully. At the time, I thought she simply wanted to make sure her affairs were organized. What I did not realize then was how carefully she had arranged everything. Daniel cleared his throat and asked me directly if there was something about the documents that I believed he had misunderstood. His tone was still polite, but there was now a hint of uncertainty beneath it. I reached into my handbag, which I had placed on the chair beside me earlier that morning, and slowly pulled out a smaller envelope. It was not thick like the one Daniel had given me, and it did not have the name of a law office printed in the corner. Instead, it contained a single folded document that I had kept with me ever since that afternoon with our mother. Rachel's eyes immediately moved toward the envelope in my hand. Daniel watched silently as I placed it on the table beside the stack of eviction papers. I explained that after our mother signed her final will, she also added an additional clause that was meant to protect the house if certain circumstances ever appeared within the family. Daniel's expression changed slightly when he heard that. He asked what kind of clause I was talking about. I answered honestly that it was something our mother had discussed only with me because she believed I would understand the importance of preserving the house for future generations. The room remained quiet while Daniel considered this information. Rachel looked at him briefly and then back at me, clearly trying to understand where this conversation was heading. I unfolded the document slowly and turned it so the printed words faced them across the table. The paper had been signed and notarized on the same day as the original will. I explained that according to this clause, any attempt to transfer ownership of the property without reviewing every section of the will could create legal complications that would require immediate review by the family attorney. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the page as if he were seeing it for the first time. The calm certainty he had shown earlier that morning began to fade just a little. I watched his reaction carefully and then spoke again in the same steady voice. I told him that before we continued discussing eviction notices or selling the house, it might be wise to contact the attorney who helped prepare our mother's final documents. Because if there was one thing I had learned from her over the years, it was that she never left important decisions unfinished. And something about this situation suggested that Daniel and Rachel might not yet know the entire story behind the house on Maplewood Drive. I could see the shift in Daniel's posture the moment he began reading the document I had placed on the table. Only a few minutes earlier, he had looked completely certain about everything that was happening that morning. Now his eyes moved slowly across the page, scanning each line as if he were trying to understand how something so important could exist without his knowledge. Rachel leaned slightly toward him, trying to read the document from where she sat, but Daniel lifted it closer to his face and continued studying the text. The room remained quiet except for the low hum of the oven and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I waited patiently because I knew exactly what Daniel was seeing. The clause our mother had added was written in simple but very clear language. It explained that although the house could be transferred between family members under certain conditions, any attempt to remove a resident who had been maintaining the property for an extended period of time would automatically trigger a legal review of the entire will. The purpose of the clause was to prevent decisions that ignored the responsibilities different family members had taken on after our parents were gone. When Daniel finally lowered the paper, the calm confidence he had shown earlier was no longer there. He asked where I had gotten that document, even though he already knew the answer. I reminded him that our mother gave it to me personally the same afternoon she asked me to help organize her final paperwork. At the time, she told me she wanted someone in the family to remember that the house was not simply a piece of property. It was the place where generations of our family had gathered, and she believed that anyone making decisions about it should respect that history. Rachel spoke for the first time in several minutes and asked if the clause meant the eviction notice was invalid. I explained that the document did not automatically cancel anything, but it did require the family attorney to review every step of the ownership transfer before any legal action against a long-term resident could continue. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked toward the kitchen window, as if he were replaying the entire situation in his mind. The confidence he had shown earlier that morning had clearly been based on the belief that all the paperwork was already settled. Now he was realizing that the story might not be finished yet. I gently reminded him that our mother always paid close attention to details, especially when it came to the future of the house. She understood that emotions could sometimes cloud judgment, and that was exactly why she added the clause in the first place. Rachel glanced toward the envelope containing the eviction notice and then back at Daniel. Her earlier certainty seemed to fade as well. For a moment, none of us spoke. The smell of the turkey had grown stronger as it continued roasting in the oven, filling the house with the same familiar warmth that had always meant Thanksgiving was beginning. Yet the conversation around the table had taken a very different direction from what Daniel had expected. Finally, Daniel looked back at me and asked quietly what I thought we should do. Next, I answered in the simplest way possible. I told him the best step would be to call the attorney who helped our mother prepare her will and let him review both sets of documents. If everything Daniel believed was correct, the lawyer would confirm it. But if the clause required additional legal review, then none of us should rush into decisions that could create serious problems later. Daniel stared at the document again, reading one particular paragraph a second time as if he had missed it earlier. Rachel sat silently beside him, her hands folded on the tablecloth. I remained calm because there was no reason to rush the conversation now. What mattered was that the situation had changed. Daniel had started the morning believing he was presenting the final word about the house on Maplewood Drive. Now he was beginning to understand that our mother may have written a very different ending to that story. Daniel remained quiet for a long moment after reading the clause again, his eyes moving slowly across the lines as if the words might rearrange themselves into something simpler if he looked long enough. The confidence he had carried into the room earlier that morning had faded into something more cautious. Rachel sat beside him, her expression thoughtful now instead of certain, and the two of them exchanged a brief glance that seemed to say far more than any words. Outside the window, the late morning sunlight had grown brighter, casting long pale shadows across the front yard where the maple tree stood bare against the cold November sky. Inside the house, the familiar warmth of the oven continued filling the kitchen, and the smell of turkey roasting had become stronger, reminding me that Thanksgiving was still unfolding whether our conversation was comfortable or not. Daniel finally placed the document back on the table between us and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin slowly, as if weighing every possibility that had just appeared. He admitted quietly that he had never seen that clause before. The attorney who helped with the ownership transfer had only discussed the sections of the will related to property distribution. According to Daniel, the lawyer explained that the house had been legally assigned to him as the primary heir and that the paperwork filed during the summer simply finalized that decision with the county records office. What Daniel had not expected was the possibility that another document might complicate that process. I nodded calmly because I understood exactly how confusing legal matters could become when several documents were involved. Our mother had always believed in preparing for every situation, especially when it came to protecting the things that mattered to her. The house on Maplewood Drive was more than just a structure with four walls and a roof. It was the place where birthdays had been celebrated, where school projects had been built at the kitchen table, where our parents had welcomed friends and relatives year after year. She knew that once she was gone, the future of the house might not be simple. Rachel broke the silence by asking whether the attorney who prepared the clause was the same one who handled the will itself. I explained that it was indeed the same family lawyer who had advised our parents for many years. His office had been located downtown for nearly 3 decades, and he knew the history of the property almost as well as we did. Daniel nodded slowly, clearly realizing that contacting the attorney might be the only way to clarify everything. For a moment, he looked toward the envelope containing the eviction notice, and then back at the clause I had brought with me. The contrast between the two stacks of paper seemed almost symbolic of the situation itself. One represented the decision Daniel believed had already been finalized. The other represented the careful planning our mother had quietly prepared long before any of us realized it might matter. I told Daniel that calling the attorney did not mean anyone was accusing him of doing something wrong. It simply meant making sure every document was understood correctly before any final steps were taken. Rachel agreed softly that it would be wise to confirm everything before moving forward with plans to sell the house. The earlier tension around the table began to soften slightly as the conversation shifted from confrontation to careful consideration. Daniel eventually reached for his phone, turning it slowly in his hand as if he were thinking about the next step. He admitted that when he arrived that morning he had believed the entire situation was straightforward. The eviction notice, the ownership transfer, even the potential sale of the house had all seemed like practical decisions. Now he understood that the story might be more complicated than he first thought. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the dining room once more, noticing the familiar photographs on the walls and the quiet afternoon light beginning to fill the house. For the first time since I opened that envelope earlier that morning, I felt a sense of calm returning. Our mother had always believed that patience and careful thinking could solve problems that seemed impossible at first. And as Daniel finally unlocked his phone to search for the attorney's number, I realized that this Thanksgiving morning might still end the way she would have wanted, with the truth about the house on Maplewood Drive finally brought into the open.